All right, so we are, as I mentioned in the final session of the introductory module. Today we're sort of looking at something that is necessarily required for as we step into the next core module, which will be looking at argument for God's existence. So we would need sort of like a philosophical background to deal with that because those arguments are philosophical in nature. So this we won't be going in too much of a depth because the topic is philosophical, so I don't want to overcrowd our mind with so much of jargons and stuff, but to give some essential points to cover with. So the questions we would look at is 4 points. One is, what is philosophy? Then, is philosophy superior to science? What are the types of arguments? And then finally, is philosophy relevant to the Christian? So these would be the 4 key questions that we will be covering today. Well, what is philosophy? So there is this quote by Albert Camus in his work, The Myth of Sisyphus, where he says, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. So Albert Camus is known as a philosopher of absurdity because he was working through with the philosophical problem of, what is the meaning of life, what is the purpose of life, and he came about the conclusion that life is absurd, which is why he is called as the philosopher of absurdity. But the reason this quote stands out is that it gives you a quick idea about what is the question that normally philosophy deals with. The idea of why are we living, what is life, and as such, which are in a very abstract sense, they're very fundamental. It's only if you come to this understanding of that there is some meaning or purpose to life that you would want to live, and it's only when you decide that you want to live that you would engage in other activities. Now, why would you pursue music and arts and stuff if you still haven't figured out whether you should live or not? So this quote gives us a brief overview on what are the questions that the field of philosophy generally deals with. So by definition, if you look at what philosophy is, if you look at it as an academic discipline, then here we would pursue understanding about things like knowledge, reality, and existence. These are very abstract stuff. We know stuff, we know what is happening in the real world, and we know that we exist. But then philosophy would engage into these questions in a very core element, in a core sense, to figure out what does it mean to have knowledge? How do we know things that we know? What is the difference between knowing and understanding? Is the reality really real? Are we part of reality? And so on and so forth. You would get into really complex questions. So philosophy is the discipline that would engage in these very abstract, fundamental questions that we normally don't deal with. So this also shows us why philosophy is important. We'll look at that later, that we are looking at these very fundamental questions. By definition, philosophy is broken on 2 words, philo and sophia, meaning love of wisdom. So in that sense also we see that philosophy is not necessarily an academic discipline relegated just to universities and stuff, but if you sort of say that you pursue wisdom, you want to know wisdom, you are engaging in philosophical activity in one way or the other, which is why Alvin Plantinga's this paraphrase quote makes so much sense. Philosophy is thinking really hard. Then we get to see that all of us do philosophy one way or the other. We may not do it in the academic discipline sense, but when we think about life, when we ponder about the deep mysteries of life, when we think about even when you think about your job and stuff, we engage in some way of philosophically engaging with that question. Now, what are the areas that philosophy would normally deal with? Well, basically there are 3 areas that philosophy engages with. One is yeah, I hope you were able to see my screen all along. Yeah, hopefully. So so the first area it deals with is the study of existence or being. Again, it sounds very complicated, very sophisticated. That is by definition how normally philosophy deals with. It goes into these very nuanced, technical, abstract, fundamental areas that we normally take for granted. So one is the study of existence. What does it mean to exist? What is the difference between existence and non-existence, and all of that stuff. Then we study about how do we know what we know, the aspect of knowledge. Then the third area is study of right and wrong. So when we look at it as jargons, then we will break it down as ontology, epistemology, ethics, and so on and so forth. So these are the 3 main domains of philosophy. So every philosophical inquiry would come into one or the other. And sometimes the domain of logic is kept separate and distinct from the rest of the domains. And even my correspondence with Paul Gould, or when I was looking through, surfing through the database on philosophy, this point was just kept on repeating that you would define these three domains, and then you would mention logic as a separate domain if needed. But this is generally how philosophy is engaged with in the academic area. Now the next question is, and this is something that we may often come across in our current world, there is this perception about how science is superior and science is the only way to know reality. And so the question needs to be asked, is philosophy superior to science, or is science superior to philosophy? Because the idea is that we have an impression in our mind that the only way to know about things around us, the only way to know about reality is through purely empirical mechanisms. So you test it out in the laboratory and you know it, and that's the only way to know about it. Everything else is pointless, which is why you would see a lot of atheists going after and holding on to science a lot. This sort of this adoration for the field of science, because they want to stick with something that is purely empirical. And then the realm of natural, supernatural, and theology and philosophy gets beyond that purely empirical, tangible realm. And because they have a disinvestment, a disinclinity towards those fields, they find themselves liking and preferring science over other fields. So this question has to be asked. No, is science superior to philosophy, or is philosophy superior to science? Well, what is science by definition? As you see, it's an activity of getting to know the natural world through a specific method, which is observation and experiment. That is basically what the field of science is. We're studying the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. So we see that science is by definition tangible. It is by definition restricted to the way of how you know about reality. So if you use a scientific mechanism to know reality, you would have to go through the way of observation and experimentation to know reality, which gives us this distinction between science and philosophy clearly. Because philosophy deals with more fundamental and abstract stuff. When we talk about knowledge, reality, and existence, these are very abstract. What do you mean by the word abstract? Think about numbers. You don't hold numbers, you don't touch numbers, and we don't find numbers in the real world, but they sort of exist in our mind. Because the question is, can you find the number 5 in the real world? Can you find the original number 5? You can't, but they exist in all of our minds, right? That is sort of the nature of being abstract. And then fundamental means something very essential and basic to us. So that is what philosophy deals in. It deals in fundamental and abstract matters. Science and other disciplines, if you take economics or literature, they deal in stuff that are more concrete and in some way sophisticated. Now, when I say sophisticated, I'm not saying that it is superior in that sense, but it is more above the fundamental level. But the thing is, because philosophy is fundamental, if you take that out, you suddenly have the whole structure crumbling down. That is because of the key questions that philosophy engages in, that science cannot engage in. The key areas that philosophy alone can tackle with, that science and other fields have to borrow from philosophy to apply in their field. Which is why if you take a discipline, science, physics, biology, economics, literature, any discipline, it will have a philosophy of that discipline. So there's a philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, philosophy of economics, philosophy of literature, which is new information to me. All of these disciplines have this philosophical inquiry into it, because all of the disciplines have a methodology that you take for granted and apply. But are those methods accurate? Are those methods valid? Is that a right way of knowing and making sense of whatever is your subject of study? That's where you would need philosophy to step in. So to quickly point out the distinction between science and philosophy as an example, my video and audio is captured through this mechanical, electrical, and digital mechanisms. Now we can know about the reliability of these mechanisms through the scientific method. But what about the reliability of the content of my talk? Am I talking contradictory stuff? Am I making sense? Is my logic valid? All of this is not something that science would deal with. All the mechanisms, tangible stuff, things that you touch and hold, science deals with. Things that you don't touch and hold, but it is essential to what I'm talking. It's fundamental to what I'm talking. That is where philosophy steps in. Now we look at 5 quick areas that we can keep in mind where science is unable to deal with. The first one is, look at the sentence. The universe began to exist, and the sentence, the universe didn't begin to exist. Well, we immediately realize the fact that both of these cannot be true at the same time. How do we know? This is not something that science tells us. But the inquiry about whether the universe began to exist or not is an inquiry that science has a lot of vested interest in. The Big Bang theory, the multiverse hypothesis, the baby universe hypothesis, oscillating model. There are so many scientific models out there which try to probe the question of whether the universe began to exist or not. But when you ask the question, can these both statements be true at the same time? Well, you can't answer that using scientific mechanisms. You would have to look to philosophy, basically the laws of logic. And if you look at numbers also, you have to look at the laws of arithmetic to make sense of it. Science borrows from philosophy. These fundamental assumptions are taken from philosophy and then are used in our scientific inquiry. The second question, am I dreaming right now? Well, think about it right now. Can you actually prove to yourself that you're not dreaming right now? What if this interaction right now, the laptop in front of me, the screen in front of me, you hearing my voice, me speaking to you, what if this is all part of a dream? I mean, how many times have we woken up from a dream thinking that we just fell off a river, or we felt like we were falling into the water? We actually felt like we were really falling. But then we woke up and we thought, oh, you know what, it's a dream. But do we really know if this exact moment is not a dream? Can science answer that? No. So there are these metaphysical things, sort of. It's a very rudimentary way of saying it, but things that are beyond the normal physical realm, physical inquiry. So there are these metaphysical questions that science cannot deal with, that you would need philosophy to come and engage with. The other question, how long can a newborn survive without food? Well, how long? Well, you would need experimentation and observation that science uses to answer this question, right? But should you use those to answer this question? Is this an answer that we really want? Should we put a newborn baby through the experiment and observation to get the answer? Science can answer it. You need ethics to tell you whether if that's the right thing or a wrong thing to do. This is where philosophy would step in. Science still cannot do anything here. If you tell a scientist that is an ethical thing to do, then the scientist would apply that in their research. Plagiarism, it is taken as granted in the field of research that your work has to be unique and original. If you're mentioning or something that is already existing, you have to attribute it to the original author. That is taken as granted as an essential part of scientific research or research in any field. But the idea of plagiarism, why is that we should not plagiarize? Is it right? Is it wrong? Comes from the field of ethics, which philosophy deals with. And ask the question, we know Raja Ravi Verma, famous painter from Kerala, or any other painting and sculpture. How is it that we grasp the beauty of those things? Why is it that we look at the sunset and we find beauty in it? Or the light phenomenon in the northern part, towards the North Pole, I forgot the name, that we look at and we are mesmerized by it. Can we comprehend that by any scientific mechanism? Can we capture the beauty through science? Well, not really. We apprehend it in an instantaneous way that we can't really grasp and explain. The only way we portray the beauty that we see in the world is through poetry and literature, not through scientific research papers. So can science contribute towards our apprehension of the beauty in the world? Not really. That's where philosophy would come in to ask the question, is beauty real? Is beauty objective? Is beauty subjective? Is it dependent on from people to people? All of those questions that concern beauty, aesthetics would come under philosophy. Then finally the question, is the speed of light constant? The special theory of relativity, general theory of relativity, they all assume that the speed of light is constant to make the equations work. That is an assumption that science itself makes to work with the model that they have. Science cannot prove those assumptions wrong. They are assuming that the speed of light is the same to work with the equations beforehand. So these are the 5 areas that science has to borrow from other fields or to take it as granted to take the step forwards. The areas of laws of logic and arithmetic, metaphysical truths, am I dreaming right now, and as such, morality, then aesthetics and beauty, and finally the assumptions that science itself makes. So these are 5 areas where science is dependent on other fields, specifically philosophy, to make sense and make progress. So now that we've seen what philosophy is not, what science is, the necessity for having philosophy, we're going to look at the arguments that we will use in the core module when you look at the arguments for God's existence. So there are 2 types of arguments that we will be using in our inquiry to see are they good arguments to show that God exists or not. So we will look at these 2 arguments which come under the realm of philosophy. So let's look at the first type of argument. Consider this. If Christ did resurrect, then he is God. The next statement says Christ did resurrect. So the conclusion is, therefore, he is God. This is an example of a type of argument. It makes sense. It's simple. P1, P2, if they're both true, you get C, the conclusion. Pretty straightforward. This is known as a deductive argument. And deductive arguments as a category have a very simple structure. So you have those P1 and P2. Well, we call them as premises, or you can keep in mind as key sentences. These are sentences that are very key to the argument. So basically, you have those key sentences that would lead you to the conclusion. P1 and P2, and that drops you directly to the conclusion, which is why we call deductive arguments as airtight. There is no escape way out of it. If you structure it properly, if it's all good to go, then one leads to the other inevitably. There is no escape hatch out of it. So if you need a deductive argument to be really good, you need two criteria. One is the key sentences or the premises must be true, and then the logic must be valid. Well, what do I mean to say that the logic must be valid? You will have come across on Facebook or Instagram these posts of the big word written Amen in big letters, and then the caption says, if you type Amen right now in the comments and share with people, a good thing will happen in your life. And we would go right, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't strike us as that would cause a good thing to happen in our lives. Basically, we are trying to apply logic to see if the logic of that caption is valid or not. That's basically what we're doing there. And therefore, we will say, that caption is illogical. It's in the similar sense that you can apply here. Are those sentences connecting to each other? Does sentence 1 lead to sentence 2? And does sentence 2 lead to the conclusion? Do they make sense? Which is basically what we're asking. So 2 criteria. The key sentence must be true and the logic must be valid. So we will look at 2 examples of bad arguments to sort of get the right picture. So consider this example. The key sentence 1 says, if there is a traffic jam, then I will be late. The second sentence is, I am late. So we say to the conclusion, therefore, there was a traffic jam. Now, immediately this strikes us as a good argument, right? Because we see this in our daily life. If you get stuck in a traffic jam, you will be late. So if someone comes up to the office and they're late and you go like, was that a traffic jam? Because we see this happening in our real world. But the key thing to keep in mind is that when we're looking at arguments, we have to keep aside our background information as relating to that aside and look at the arguments for what they are really worth to see if that argument is really valid or not. So what we see here is that the sentences are true. If there is a traffic jam, you will be late. Yeah, that is true. And you end up being late. That is also true. But the conclusion does not follow from that because you are using invalid logic. What does it mean? The argument says that you will be late if there is a traffic jam. So the thing that must happen next is that there must be a traffic jam, not that you will be late. The reason is, if you look at the argument is telling us that if there is a traffic jam, then you will be late. Not that you will be late if there is a traffic jam. It's not the other way around. The argument is telling us that if there is a traffic jam, then you will be late. The next thing that the argument must show us if there was a traffic jam or not. That is what the argument should show. Now, again, when we look at this, instantly we may feel like this is a sound argument because why? This happens in daily life. But that is beside the point. If the argument has to be good, it must follow the laws of logic. And this is why this argument, even though it strikes us immediately as logical, it fails here. Because the argument is making a particular claim and it can't hold up to it. So here you have the second sentence, I will be late shown as true, which won't work the other way around. The traffic jam sentence must come as true in P2 saying there was a traffic jam. So you would say, therefore I was late, which is what we see here. If Christ did resurrect, then he is God. So the emphasis on is if Christ resurrected or not. So we say Christ did resurrect. So it follows the second part. Therefore, he is God. That must be the structure that must always be followed. Now, there are very nuances and technicalities to it on various ways of formulating a deductive argument, but this is in its simplest form. And this is a simple error that often happens. You have two statements that make sense, but they don't follow each other because the argument isn't holding up to what it is supposed to show us. I hope that is clear, but again, if it sticks out, then we will sort of bash it out towards the Q&A. Now, here's the next one, which was a surprise for me to learn. If Jesus were not Lord, he would be a liar or lunatic. The next sentence says Jesus was neither a liar or lunatic. So the conclusion is, therefore, Jesus is Lord. Surprisingly, the logic holds, right? Because if Jesus is not Lord, liar, or lunatic, you remove liar and lunatic. So you have the final thing that is left, that is Jesus must be Lord. But the issue is that the key sentence 1, P1, is false. Now, we normally hear this as the trilemma, that C.S. Lewis put forward as Lord, liar, lunatic. And this is how we may often get it presented. The issue is that there is a fourth option that is left out. Maybe Jesus could be a liar, a lunatic, or Lord, or he may be a legend. Now, I came to know about the fact that this is a bad argument through William Lane Craig. So I would trust his philosophical skill set to inform me on this. The reason is you have the fourth option left out. So even though the rest of the logic makes sense, the first sentence is false, which is why this argument doesn't hold. And we often see that a lot of people would actually present this in front of audiences without realizing the fact. So you see how you take two arguments, it sounds immediately as it makes sense, but it's when you probe it technically using the tools of philosophy that you get to the nuances to see whether it makes sense or not. So those are the criteria for a deductive argument to be valid. You need the sentences to be true, and the logic must connect one after the other. When we get into the moral argument, which is an argument for God based on the fact that there are things that are right and wrong for all people across time, we will get to see a very different, a slightly sophisticated version of the deductive argument, not too complex, but we will look at that down the line. Right now, once you get the basics of the deductive argument in your mind, that is key. Simple structure, airtight, the sentences lead to the conclusion, the sentences must be true, and the logic must be valid. This is the basic necessity for a deductive argument. Now let's look at the second argument. Consider this. First, there are 10 patients before you. The first patient smokes 1 cigarette. Second patient, 2 cigarettes. And it goes on, and the 10th patient smokes 10 cigarettes. The next data that you have is that the first patient is 100% healthy. Second patient is 90% healthy. And it's keep dropping until you realize that the 10th patient is 1% healthy. So therefore, we would say, smoking is injurious to health. But is it really injurious to health? Can we really come to that conclusion based on what we have before us? Not really. Why? Because this is an example of an argument called inductive arguments. So inductive arguments don't necessarily have a specific structure like a deductive argument. There it's sentence, conclusion, or 4 or 5 sentences and a conclusion. It's that sort of a thing. Inductive arguments don't have a conclusion. What you see with inductive arguments is that they make the conclusion more probable to be true than they are false. So when you look at the data, you look at the both pieces of the data, you could say, well, it is highly probable that the fact that smoking is injurious to health is true. Can we say it decisively without any counter objections? Can we say it in an airtight manner like we would do with a deductive argument? Not really. But what would be out of touch with the argument would be to say that smoking is absolutely has zero effect on your health. You can't say that. That is way out of touch with the data that you have. What would be in line with the data to say is that smoking seems to be injurious to health. Now, how certain can you be? It differs. How much of data that you have, how the rest of the argument goes, so on and so forth. So inductive arguments are a different form in that they just show you that the conclusion would be more probable. It is much more possible. It's a wrong way to say it, but for simplicity, I'm saying it. It is much more possible that the conclusion is true than the possibility that the conclusion is false. You don't really say that the conclusion is definitely true. You do that with deductive arguments. With deductive arguments, if P1 and P2 is true, then the conclusion must be true. There is no way out. Airtight, you reach directly the conclusion. With inductive arguments, that doesn't necessarily happen. You get closer to the conclusion, but you can't really say if you have actually reached the conclusion or not. You keep on working towards it. And we use this type of inductive arguments in apologetics, which is where we infer, we try to reach towards the best explanation of the data that we have. So like here, we have two data that we have, and we ask, okay, what is the best explanation of the data before us? Well, the best explanation, given the data, is that smoking is injurious to health, or that smoking does have an impact on your health. There may be better explanations that we may not have considered. There may be more data to consider into it, but we try and get closer towards what best explains the data before us. And that is something that we use in apologetics, specifically when we look at the question of the resurrection. So we'll just quickly touch upon that as we come to the final bit. So here's how we would use the best explanation inference in apologetics. So we have these pieces of data before us. Jesus crucifixion buried. He was buried in a well-known city. Now this is known as the Jerusalem factor, in the sense that Jesus was buried in a well-known city in Jerusalem. So you can't really say, we don't know where Jesus' tomb is. We can't access the tomb. So Jesus is crucified publicly, buried in a well-known tomb. His tomb is empty. His first eyewitness were women. The deserted disciples who leave Jesus come back to say that they are actually staying with Jesus, affirming their loyalty. The disciples claim they see the risen Jesus. Paul and James, the brother of Jesus, who rejected Christ, who were against Christianity, come to believe that Jesus did actually rise. And then we know with a great deal of certainty that Paul, James, and Peter were martyred for their Christian faith without recanting the statement that Jesus is God and that he rose from the dead. So we have all of this data before us. Now the question is, what explanation best fits the data? What makes most sense of the data? There are a lot of technicalities towards navigating this. We will look at it in depth when we look at the argument for the resurrection. But there are many theories out there. There is a theory that Jesus didn't really die, called the apparent death hypothesis. Jesus really didn't die on the cross. He went through some sort of subconscious state, and then he was rejuvenated with all the herbs that he was wrapped up in with. There is a theory that Jesus had a twin brother that no one knew of. There is a theory that Jesus' tomb was misplaced, so they kept it in the wrong tube, and the woman came to the wrong tube. There is a view that Jesus was never really buried, saying that the body of the crucified victims were thrown into mass graves, so Jesus was never really buried. There is the theory that Jesus' disciples lied about it, and so on and so forth. And then there is a theory that Jesus did actually rise from the dead physically. So we would ask, given all of this explanation, what best fits the data? So it gets us closer towards the conclusion, but doesn't really give us an airtight format, which is why people would keep on coming up with these different theories, right? Because you still have all of these theories in front of you. You may pick one as the best explanation, but the door is still open for people to come in with objections. With deductive arguments, not really the case. You have to strike the argument at the sentence or the logic to do anything else. You can't just simply throw in random explanations and expect them to work. But with the resurrection or with other forms where we use inductive arguments, you would see a lot of explanations and theories out there, because the door is still open for you to bring in objections. Because you haven't reached the conclusion with 100% certainty. You're closer to it, but not fully there. So there is that gap that people can strike in and keep in some random conspiracy theory, like Jesus had a twin brother and stuff, to somehow make sense of the rest of the data. So this is the way that we will be using deductive arguments when we talk about, why does the universe exist? What is the cause of the universe? Did the universe begin to exist? If so, who began the universe to exist? And we ask the question of, why is there so much order in the universe? Do right and wrong really exist? Then did Jesus really rise from the dead? In asking these questions and arguments that point towards God's existence, we use the philosophical tools and argument styles of deductive and inductive arguments. So I hope the explanation that we've given for the arguments made sense. But when we get into the core module, we will be going through those arguments specifically. So we will have time to brush up and go through them. And we will be walking through the arguments in much more depth than briefly running through it, which means that you would get to see the arguments in action. The final point to touch upon is that, well, is philosophy relevant to the Christian? You talked about philosophy, arguments, and all of that stuff. But to a Christian who is called to live a life in submission to Christ, called with the command to evangelism, called with the life of following Christ, taking up our cross and following the Christ. To us, is this field of philosophy relevant? Because isn't this too much out there? Isn't this too academic and abstract and stuff? Does it make sense to us? That's the question that needs to be answered. There's this quote by Norman Geisler where he says, you can't know error without studying truth, and you can't answer error without studying philosophy. So Norman Geisler actually points out to us Christians that if you have an interest to answer errors and false answers, well, you have got to study philosophy. But let's look at these two statements. There are no humans on earth, and the statement 5 + 5 is equal to 10. The question is, were these statements true even when there were no humans on earth? So think how many number of years that you want to think back, right? To the point there were actually not even any human on earth before Adam and Eve. The question is, were these statements true back then when there were no humans? Well, the conclusion we immediately come to is that, yeah, they are true, even if there are humans or not. So which leads us to the question, okay, if that is the case, if these statements can be true, if mathematics can hold true, well, what is the foundation? What is the source? What is the grounding for these statements and mathematical equations? Because you already removed humans out of the picture. There is no humans there to work or deal with it, but apparently they are all true. So this is the philosophical question to be asked. What is the grounding or the foundation or the basis for what is the grounding or the foundation or basis for, yeah, actually we'll look at that in the Q&A time. The mouse. So
No, you can answer towards the end. I just asked, put the
yeah,
question.
we just lost the mouse track. We can't find the mouse on screen. So that's a delay. Yeah. So this is a philosophical question, right? Where do you ground logic and arithmetics if you don't have humans? So then we are in sort of this inquiry to see where you will end up grounding, laws of logic and arithmetic. So let's look at and see if Christianity has something to offer to this question. So John 1 verse 1 points out saying, in the beginning was Logos, and Logos was with God, and Logos was God. When you look at the meaning of the word Logos, as you would see in Greek, sentence, discourse, reason, rule, ratio, all of these terms, which is why theologians point out saying that John 1 verse 1 is one of the most clear passages that talks to us about the relation of logic and reason to God's nature. Because John 1 verse 1 is pointing us most clearly that reason and logic aren't things that humans invented, but rather they are grounded, part of God's essential nature, just as numbers are. Which is yet another interesting thing for us to focus on, but I don't want to dwell on it. So we have a philosophical, so consider this. We have a philosophical question that we were asking earlier. Where is laws of logic and reason grounded? If these two statements are true, even when there were no humans on earth. So there is a philosophical question. What is the foundation, grounding, basis for laws of logic and numbers? This philosophical question is answered from theology. This is a good place for us to see the interdisciplinary connection that philosophy and theology can bring towards how you can apply the tools of philosophy in answering theological questions, and how theology can bring answers to deep philosophical questions. We saw in the beginning when Albert Camus said, there is one truly philosophical problem, and that is suicide. To ask the question of philosophically, is there a meaning to life? Is there purpose to life? Is life valuable? You will have Christian theology come and give the answer to philosophical question, which shows us the interlinking between philosophy and theology, how we Christians can tap into the field of philosophy and give most pressing answers to most pressing questions in philosophy. Because these questions will be asked by a non-Christian, and they'll be pondering, is life meaningful? Is life valuable? And we saw in the last session when Nitish gave us the answers that you will have only meaning, value, and purpose in your life if God does exist. And when we look at scripture, we see this passage in 1 Corinthians 1:24, which refers to Christ as the power of God and the wisdom of God. It's a very interesting usage. In Proverbs 8, in the beginning of Proverbs 8, the Proverbs refers to wisdom in a very personified manner. And then when we come to Proverbs 8, 20 and 30, it says, then I, which is wisdom, represented as a person saying, then I was a skilled craftsman at his side. At whose side? At God's side. When he marked out the foundation of the earth. So it refers to wisdom in a personified manner, not as simply knowledge or reality in abstract sense, but in a personified manner, and tells us that wisdom was alongside God during the act of creation as someone involved in creation itself. And then you come to Colossians 1:16, very powerful passage about Christ's divinity. It says, for in him, in Christ, all things were created. And says towards the end, all things have been created through him and for him. So when you keep all of these passages together, we see in Colossians, Proverbs, Corinthians, and we see what we see in John 1 verse 1, and the fact that laws of logic and reason are not grounded in humans, but they are grounded in God's mind. We come to the realization that God created the physical reality that we see, the stars, the planet, the order in the universe, the mechanism with which we understand truth. Everything is grounded in God's blueprint of logic, which is why we see that Christ is the wisdom of God, the eternal logos. Hence, it starts making sense to us to say that through Christ and by Christ, everything that is created was created. Because if Christ is the creator, what does it mean to say that through Christ, everything that is created was created? We see that, right? All things have been created through him. What does it mean to say through him? By him makes sense. He created things, makes sense. But to say that through Christ, everything is created doesn't strike us immediately until we see that. We see this physical reality having an order, a logic to it. You find numbers, the things, again, numbers that we don't find in the real world, numbers that exist in our mind can be used to make sense of the universe, can be used to make sense of the power of gravity, can be used to make sense of the expansion of the universe, all of that. You suddenly see these abstract things, these fundamental things like numbers and laws of logic working all throughout reality, even in our pursuit of how the universe began. what was the initial state of the universe, what is the power of gravity, how far away is that planet away from us. In all of this, you see logic and numbers working in synchrony towards this physical universe. And the best explanation that Judeo-Christian worldview puts forward, that is still by far miles ahead of any other explanation, is that the physical reality is built on the blueprint of logic that is grounded in God's nature. And we see John 1 verse 1 that Christ is the eternal logos. And we see in Corinthians that Christ is the wisdom of God. When we come to the realization that Christ is the eternal logos, the eternal reason, the grounding of logic and rationality, and that Christ is the wisdom of God, then philosophy, which is defined as the love of wisdom, is not something merely pursuing some worldly wisdom to the Christian. It is pursuing Christ's nature and the essential attribute of God, of Him being the source of all logic, all reason. Because we all value reason and logic so much in our life. If someone is talking to you and they don't make sense, you suddenly feel frustrated. If someone is giving you a criticism and it isn't really constructive, or it doesn't make sense, you no longer want to hear that criticism. We want to appear to other people as sensible people, as logical people, as a rational people. We all value the importance that reason, logic, rational, and being sensible plays in our life. And to a Christian who realizes that it is within God's nature that reason, logic, and all of this hold true, and that Christ is the eternal logos, and that Christ is the wisdom of God, then pursuing wisdom, loving wisdom, which philosophy basically is, becomes much more interesting and should be interesting and much more relatable to us than it would be to any other person out there. So Paul K. Moses says this famous quote: if philosophy is the love and pursuit of wisdom, Christian philosophy is love and pursuit of wisdom under the authority of Christ, which calls for an ongoing union with Christ, including one's belonging to God in Christ. So you see how to a Christian, philosophy isn't just a merely academic discipline, but something that is very core to what we hold in our faith as a Christian. And it is pertinent that we engage with this field of understanding reason, logic, using it in our daily life, because Rick Warren says that a violent battle is raging. It is raging for our mind. It is an unfair battle. It is unrelenting. And the reason the battle is so intense is that our greatest asset is our mind. And that is what the enemy aims for. Oftentimes in our life, we would ask ourselves questions on trying to make sense of life. In points where we figure out why certain things are happening the way, we are tapping into our intellectual side to make sense of reality. And if we suddenly see that we can't make sense of reality, it disturbs us. If we suddenly realize that we don't know why things are happening the way, it disturbs us. We lose sleep, we lose any motivation to do anything, and it suddenly destabilizes us. Which is why Rick Warren points out that our mind is our greatest asset. And we are called to love the Lord, our God, with all our heart, mind, and strength. And which is why we engage in the field of philosophy, not merely as an academic discipline going to Oxford or reading a book on philosophy, but pursuing and seeking out logic and reason in our life, pursuing and falling in love with wisdom in general, because we see that Christ is the wisdom of God and that He is the grounding of logic. Then suddenly philosophy is not something that is distant to a Christian, but something that is close to his heart as a Christian, because of what we see in Scripture on the grounding of logic, reason, and so on and so forth. And hence, engaging in philosophical dialogues on these questions, maybe not as sophisticated as it may be out there, but merely engaging in dialogue and conversation is a means by which we worship the Lord with our mind, our greatest asset. And that is what we will be doing in the core modules, where we are tapping into our greatest asset to tap into philosophical arguments to ask the question: are there good reasons to think that God exists? Are there good reasons to think that Christ rose from the dead? We are tapping into our asset, using the tool of philosophy to pursue and seek out wisdom and truth for what it really is. And that is a mission and vision that is close to the Christian mind. So I hope what we've covered so far made sense to you all. Now, I know that Jacob has put in a question, but before I move into that, is there anything that anyone wants me to clarify with this? There is a lot to unpack, so I hope I made sense with whatever I said so far. Anything to go back and touch on, any arguments or anything? If not, I'll just respond to Jacob's answer.
Jacob, I had a doubt. See, when we speak about the best arguments that we're going to bring for both the parties or both the phases or both the situations, when we actually look into the best arguments, how sure can we come to a conclusion with the best arguments? in a sense, is not the best arguments are not enough. Can we say that, okay, now I have a best argument to prove this is something is true? Does that actually that arguments make that event true or that thing true? Even that can go wrong, right? For example, if I bring my conclusion on resurrection, if I prove myself saying, okay, these are the arguments that actually proves the resurrection did happen. Okay, whatever the arguments that I'm bringing, another party will also have certain arguments, counter arguments on what I have shared. At the same time, some other arguments to prove that resurrection did not happen. So if we find both on a balance where both have a best arguments, so can we come to a conclusion saying that, okay, because I got a best argument, this is true?
Yeah. So yeah, you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's not really that the argument makes something true, but we're trying to grasp if something is true through the argument. That is a mechanism, and we use that argument to try and reach the conclusion and see if that is really true or not. So that would be the way. The other thing, when you asked about the fact that we bring a best argument and the other person brings best argument. Now, when we say best argument, it would differ from people to people. If you ask a Christian, they may say that their best argument would be the Kalam, but to another person it may be the ontological argument. To another person it would be the moral argument. So that will differ among the Christians itself. But you mentioned about the resurrection. That's why I mentioned earlier about the resurrection. We use the mechanism of inductive arguments, inferring to the best explanation. It still leaves the door open, but we can say with a level of certainty that the resurrection is the best explanation of the data before us. Again, the door is still open for someone to come in and say, there is a better explanation of all the data before us, and that is what will be kept on attempted to do on. And this is something that is not only happening in the world of Christian apologetics; it happens in our pursuit of reality elsewhere. Let's ask the question about whether the Earth is flat or a sphere. Even now, there are communities and societies, even among the scientific arena, in a very fringe way, scientists and so-called scientists and stuff who say that the Earth is flat. So even in non-Christian topics that we normally engage with, there is still the question of ambiguity on trying to make sense and see whether that fits the data, whether that is really true or not. So it should not deter us from engaging with the argument because of the fact that someone can bring a counter argument, because that will happen in every field of inquiry, that will happen everywhere else. But when we look at deductive arguments, when we say is that if those sentences are true, then the conclusion must hold, that gives us a far greater deal of certainty about the conclusion than someone else can simply object to. So if someone were, and when we look at the Kalam, this will come to play, because there are a lot of people who come with so many objections to the Kalam that has been answered for decades. Like decades ago, when Dr. Craig wrote the book, the Kalam Cosmological Argument itself, those were answered in that book, but they keep on coming up over and over again. When we suddenly see it, we think that maybe this has done away with the argument, but not really. It may be misrepresentation of the argument, and so on and so forth. The other thing is, and this gets into the heart of the person, right? Once I forgot the occasion where it was a public setting. Richard Dawkins was on stage, and the person asked him, what would it convince you to believe that God exists? So he said, and I'm just pointing out one thing for the brevity of time. He said that if I were to see, the second coming of Jesus happen before my eyes, then I would come to conclude that, God does exist. And then he said, but now if that were to happen, I would, come to conclude that maybe I am delusional, or I'm having some sort of naturally occurring some phenomenon that is making me think that happens. So even on a personal level, a person can bring to us some counter argument because of the fact of the matter that they don't want to come to the conclusion of, God exists or the universe had a beginning and so on and so forth. So that would be the other side. Again, touching upon what I said earlier, an argument doesn't make something really true. You're trying to perceive and make sense if that is really true through the mechanism of argument by applying laws of logic and so on and so forth. Then whether something is best or not would differ from people to people, and that is fine. That's totally fine. But then when you look at something like the deductive argument, well, can you say that the sentence is wrong? Can you say that the logic is not valid? Is somewhere where you can point someone in, hold someone to the corner really well. With inductive arguments, when we look at the resurrection and all, the nature of the argument is such that the door is kept a bit open, so that people can still keep on pushing in with counter objections and stuff and think that it makes sense, that somehow it makes sense to say that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, even when all the medical data that we have shows that someone cannot survive the crucifixion. The data that we know about what will happen with Jesus' body that is described shows that Jesus did really die. But then it basically comes down to the person to say, do they actually really hold that it makes sense to say that Jesus didn't really die on the cross? So we can't get to the person's mind, but these counter objections will come about. So I hope I answered the question that you asked, or did I not?
Yeah, I think it's clear.
Yeah. So when we get into the core module, right, when we look at these arguments, we will look at the objections, and then we will see some of the reason why people ask question. When we look at the Kalam, and we just ask 3 here, so I can touch into this more clearly. When we look at the Kalam cosmological argument, there is a question of can nothing create the universe? Okay, and Alex O'Connor, the Cosmic Skeptic YouTube channel guy, brilliant atheist. I highly respect him for his integrity. Studies theology at the Oxford University. He asked Dr. Craig a question that is so essentially flawed. Alex O'Connor asked Dr. Craig the question that we as chapter directors are trained to answer, and we guys aren't that brilliant as such as Alex O'Connor is. But you see that these sort of objections come in a wide variety of forms, not because they're really good, but sometimes people miss the key point in it and end up asking, which is why Alex O'Connor, someone who has been studying philosophy for a long time, someone who is dealing in the question of God, atheism, and that in such depth, debating and all of that stuff, would even end up making such a simple mistake. So that could be the reason why the other person thinks that their argument is best, and maybe coming towards us, something as simple might have missed their mind, missed the point. But that is the other side to it. So we will see that in much more clarity when we look at the arguments for God's existence. And so Jacobson asked the question, can we have epistemology and ontology in the same argument? For example, creation. Yeah, I would say that can come about. I don't have any immediate examples coming to my mind where we have both of that crossing in.
The necessary being argument.
There we don't necessarily, the argument doesn't necessarily tap into epistemology there. It is merely asking, is a maximally great being logically consistent? That's all. Not really about how we know a maximally great being is logically consistent, or how we know whether a possible world exists. We're not asking about how we know about that stuff. We're just asking, is that logically consistent? Can such a being exist in a possible world? If it exists in a possible world, can it exist in an actual world, and so on and so forth. But do you think epistemology comes in that?
I think to prove the necessity of God, somewhere that comes into place, right?
Yeah, but that doesn't come in the argument per se, right?
No, I'm not talking about the argument, this one, like ABC and all those things. But to prove that argument, you can take epistemological arguments, right?
Yeah, because you mentioned in the chat that can they come in the same argument. So then the moral argument, right? We talk about whether objective morality exists or not. That is an ontological point. And then when we go the next step, we would ask about how we know something is right and wrong and all of that stuff. We would touch into divine command theory and all of that to point towards that why God must be the case and so on and so forth. Correct. So that will tap into both of these areas and come together. That will definitely happen.
So one of the failures of naturalism is the moment you get into epistemology, so ontologically they get into a deadlock with us towards the creation narrative. I'm not talking about the rest of the narratives.
Okay.
So ontologically they can come and have a deadlock with us. But if you look at the moment you get into what are the necessity things that you are talking about, I'm a naturalist, this one, that then immediately they get into empirical and epistemology. And I have seen people like Christopher Hitchens and these guys, right, Draper and all, they actually stopping it there and saying that from here it becomes epistemology. So we do not want to get into that. So they put it at a deadlock there and then they leave it. So what does naturalism say? Naturalism say that like what we say, that there is an uncaused cause, right, before the creation, right, and then we get into the 3 arguments, whether it is intelligent or not and all those things. Now, I'm not getting into the theistic arguments. I'm getting into the naturalist arguments. So in a naturalist argument, they say that everything is natural. Only thing is that there were some necessary things which was pre-existing, right? Now,
Yeah.
when we get into the question that, what are those necessary things? So they say that there are base necessity arguments, which, that, some 2-3 things, which is there as a base necessity, which they call out. Now, the question is, now that base necessity that you have in naturalism, how do you get into it? That gets into epistemology or empirical, this one. Now, generally, they don't have an argument for that yet, but then they come into a deadlock there at ontology. That's what I was saying.
Yeah, that I would also agree with you. Again, like I said, with the moral argument also, that similar fashion would end up where we tap into. When we look at the Kalam also, once we show that there is a cause for the universe, then we go much more than that in the analysis of analysis of the nature of the cause of the universe. So that way of cross-stepping into different disciplines will obviously happen. Yeah, that, like I said, that is on point. What you pointed out about how naturalism engages with, and then again, the evolutionary argument against naturalism is a case in point of epistemology striking them down. So yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
All right, that's it.
Yeah. So I'll just stop the recording because we have done with the questions.